Good morning, everybody. And today we're going to try and complete our discussion, first of all, about the lymphatic circulatory system. And then we're going to move on to discuss the immune system and the immune response, intimately connected to the functioning of the lymphatic system. This is where we finished off last time, and it's worthwhile revising what we talked about. First of all, shown on this diagram, here is the blood circulatory system, circulating oxygenated blood to the body under pressure from the heartbeat. That is quite high pressure in all of these vessels, even down to the very small arterioles, where the arteries subdivide into finer and finer and finer vessels. And then the arterioles lead into this capillary bed. This is a collection of the finest of the vessels of the blood circulatory system. And the pressure, if you look at the pressure on this side of the capillary bed, it's high. If you look at the pressure on that side of the capillary bed, it's low. The blood pressure within the venous system is very low. Blood pressure within the arterial system is high. And that capillary bed here acts almost like a barrier. The pressure has to be somehow relieved in the capillary bed. And it is relieved by the fact that fluid leaks out of the capillaries. The fluid that leaks out is the plasma, the serum, that in which all of the blood corpuscles and everything are suspended. And it leaks out as a clear straw-colored fluid, and it bathes all of the cells of the body. When it's in that form, when it's percolating through around the cells, we refer to it as interstitial fluid. But that interstitial fluid is gathered up by the capillaries of the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is a circulatory system, really, which is in parallel to the blood circulatory system, and it circulates this fluid. Once it's in circulation like this, we refer to it as lymph, L-Y-M-P-H, lymph. When it's busy percolating through all the cells, it does something very useful, and that is that it picks up information. It picks up, for instance, pathogens, cell products, debris, all sorts of things, and actually conducts them through the lymphatic system here to these lymph nodes, which are these organs which intersperse throughout the lymphatic system. And inside the lymph node, there are collections in high numbers of the cells of the immune system. And a lot of our immune response takes place here inside the lymph node when these cells of the immune system encounter information coming in from the lymphatics. Okay, they're picking up all this information here. In addition, there are cells which wander around our tissues, especially macrophages, which you've heard about before, and dendritic cells that you're going to hear a lot more about. And macrophages and dendritic cells also enter the lymphatic system, carrying with them information that they have gathered from their wanderings around the tissues. And they can convey that information to the lymph nodes and to the cells of the immune system, especially the lymphocytes, which are residing in the lymph node. And they can set off an immune response. The immune response very often commences inside the lymph node. So we've extracted a whole lot of volume of fluid from the blood, reduced the blood pressure in the venous system, but now we have all of this fluid circulating in the lymphatic system. And ultimately, it gets emptied back into the blood circulatory system just before the venous blood enters the heart, the lymph is emptied into the blood circulatory system again. It's actually at the subclavian veins, the entrance of the lymphatic system into the blood circulatory system. It restores the volume, the full volume of the blood. Therefore, it gets pumped out again, starts the journey all over again. The lymph nodes, we're not going to talk about their functioning in any real detail, but I'll just point out to you here, this is a typical lymph node, and they are scattered throughout our body. They are not the only lymphoid tissue. They are referred to as lymphoid tissue, and they are not the only lymphoid tissue in the body. We'll see that there's a whole lot more as well, but they're by far the most common, and they occur throughout the body. These are all the vessels that are emptying into the lymph node. So these are the afferent. Afferent means going towards. So these are afferent vessels. You can see here that they have, here's the vessel, and you can see the valves. And remember that the lymph is pushed around the vessels by contraction and relaxation of our voluntary muscles, and also of the involuntary muscles, for instance, in your gut. You also, when you breathe, etc., it exerts alternate pressure and relaxation on all of the lymphatic vessels, and it forces the fluid through them in one direction because of these valves. So we'll mention one thing. If ever you've taken a very long plane flight, and to relax, you take your shoes off and you sit there in the plane for a very, very, very long time without moving, you might find when they say we're about to commence landing procedures, you can't get your shoes back on, or you can't get them on easily because your feet have swollen. This is extremely common and completely normal. It's because you haven't been moving, and the lymph fluid has leaked out of all the capillaries in your legs and your feet and has collected, and you haven't exerted any muscle pressure on the area to pump it through all these lymphatic vessels. And what you need to do in that instance is very vigorously wiggle your feet, contract, relax the muscles, and very soon the amount of fluid decreases. You can get your shoes on in time to get your baggage and get off the plane. So the other time that we really notice that we actually have a lymphatic system, and then especially that we have lymph nodes, is when lymph nodes swell. And they usually swell in response to the presence of an infection somewhere. It's very, very common for the lymph nodes in the armpit to swell. And that is usually because there is some site of infection, usually a bacterial infection, somewhere down below. So we say that this is distal. The rest of the arm is distal to the lymph node. And the reason for that is that the lymphatic vessels are draining material from the site of infection into the lymph node, and they have excited activity within the lymph node. And it begins to accumulate fluid, and also the cells within the lymph node begin to divide very rapidly, and it increases the size of the lymph node, but the lymph node is constrained by some connective tissue. So the swelling is actually painful. And you very quickly notice that this is happening. So, a swollen, painful lymph node is usually a sign that there's an infection somewhere distal to it. A swollen, painless lymph node needs to be examined immediately. If you have a If you notice that a lymph node has become swollen, but it is painless, you need to have that examined as soon as possible. It can be completely harmless, but sometimes it's a sign of some other process, malignant process, perhaps something like that, and the lymph node needs to be biopsied to check on its status. Okay, so the lymphatic system is extremely extensive, and this is a simplified diagram of the lymph vessels, and you can see the lymph nodes interspersed, especially close to joints and all throughout the body. The most prominent clusters of lymph nodes are in the groin and under the armpits, and then here underneath the jaw. It's very, very common to have swollen, painful lymph nodes in the jaw when, for instance, you have a throat infection, because the throat infection drains into these lymph nodes and causes them to swell and become painful. Now, that's not the only lymphoid. The lymph nodes are not the only lymphoid tissue. There is a lot of other tissue which is dedicated to immune response, which is associated with all of this, the lymphatics. And so, for example, let's just go through. You may be surprised to know that one of them is the appendix in the gut. All throughout our gut, we have extensive amounts of lymphoid tissue, and we refer to it as GALT, G-A-L-T, gut-associated lymphoid tissue. All throughout the gut, there are little patches. You don't need to remember the name, but just remember that they're all throughout the gut, the large and small intestine. There are little patches of lymphoid tissue which function much like the lymph node. They are centers of immune activity. The other really important lymphoid organ is the spleen. And the spleen is important because it screens the blood directly. It screens the circulatory blood, but also it's like a giant lymph node in actual fact. But it's screening the blood, especially for infections in the blood, for stuff circulating in the blood circulatory system. The other really important lymphoid organ is the thymus gland, especially important in infants all the way up to the age of about 20. And then from the age of about 20 on, the thymus slowly decreases in size, and ultimately there's very, very little of it left. That's perfectly normal. It's not, that's just the normal lifespan of the thymus. Then, in addition, all through the respiratory system and on mucous membranes, for example, mucous membranes of the reproductive, there are also lymphoid tissues associated with them, and those we call mucus-associated lymphoid tissue, or MALT, M-A-L-T, MALT. So the picture you should get is that throughout the body, throughout all of our tissues, through all of our organs, everywhere else, there is this intensive surveillance system. The immune system is present throughout our body and is watching the whole time, ready to react to anything that it thinks is either foreign or should not be there. And we'll see how this works in a little bit. But the most important take home, just get this picture in your mind of how extensive this lymphatic system is throughout the body. Let me just see that I've covered everything. This is just a summary slide for you. Oh, the one thing I didn't mention, I'm sorry, yes, I forgot to tell you. Up here in the throat and in the nasal passages here, there at the back of the throat here are the tonsils, which are also lymphatic tissue. And then in the nasal cavity here are the adenoids. In childhood especially, this can be a problem because children may have repeated infections which cause the tonsils and the adenoids to inflame, to enlarge and become painful. In the old days, they used to immediately remove them, take children, and they used to actually do it routinely. They used to just, whether there was anything wrong with them or not, they used to remove people's tonsils and adenoids when they were about 7 or 8. This is not done so much anymore. They won't do it unless your tonsils are really, really a major problem. The tonsils lie at the back of the throat. And if you open your mouth wide and you still have your tonsils, open your mouth wide, shine a flashlight in, you can see the tonsils on either side of the throat. And they are really important surveillance mechanism because what they're responding to is not only things which you swallow, but also stuff that you breathe in. And they will respond to the presence of pathogens and things like that, that you are coming in through the mouth and nose. So nowadays, usually people still, even in adulthood, keep their tonsils and adenoids. Okay, the last thing I want to show you is a completely different function for the lymphoid, for the lymphatic system. 99% of the lymphatic system's functioning has to do with immune function. But the lymphatic system also circulates and distributes fat and oils that are absorbed from the gut. Now, what is shown here is called a villus, V-I-L-L-U-S, plural villi. And this is present in your small intestine. The wall of the gut in the small intestine is intensely folded into these little finger-like projections, and that is for absorption of nutrients. It has a blood system in here. You absorb nutrients through the walls of the villus into the blood system, and then it goes off to be distributed around the body, stored, whatever needs to be done. But the one thing which can't be absorbed here are the fats and oils. It's not absorbed easily by the blood system. Instead, the fats and oils are absorbed by a little extension of the lymphatic system here. It's called a lacteal. There it is there, this little finger-like projection, and it leads directly into the lymphatic vessels. So in fact, the lymph, along with circulating all the elements of the immune system, the lymph also circulates the fats and oils absorbed from the gut and ultimately dumps them into the blood circulatory system to be transported to wherever they need to go. So just remember that second major function for the lymphatic system. Okay, so just give me 1 second because we're going to move on now. If I can find it. Just give me 1 second. Talk amongst yourselves. Okay. Sorry. Here we go. Okay, so having introduced you to the whole lymphatic system, now we need to talk about one of the lymphatic system's major functions, which is that it is intensely connected to the immune response. So the immune response, just one sec. The responsibility of the immune system is to look at everything that is within the body and decide what is actually self, what belongs to you and belongs there, and what is non-self. Now, non-self, there are two things that are of especial importance. The first is that the immune system recognizes things like pathogens. It recognizes bacteria, viruses, which are parasites, which could cause you harm. They recognize all sorts of other parasites as well, by the way. The immune system can recognize worms and all sorts of things. But the major responsibilities are to survey for bacteria and for viruses. That's number one. The second thing that is really important is that the immune system is able to recognize things like tumors, potentially cancerous cells, and it recognizes them as non-self because they alter their nature. They change their nature from the self. That is how they become cancerous, how they begin to form tumors. And it's a very important function of the immune system to continually survey the body and eliminate things which could become cancerous. And by and large, it's very, very good at it because we are at grave risk of developing cancerous cells all the time because our cells reproduce so rapidly. And there can be errors when cells divide, especially when they replicate their DNA. That is a dangerous time. But the immune system is very, very good at spotting potentially cancerous cells and eliminating. The other things which the immune system can recognize are things like toxins. Now, I'll give you one example of this that you probably all have experience of. And that is if we injure ourselves, if you stand on a nail or something like that, you go and you have a tetanus shot. Well, what that tetanus shot is actually a vaccination. It's actually teaching your immune system what tetanus toxin looks like. Tetanus is caused by a bacterium, but the bacterium is actually no problem. You deal with the bacterium quite easily without any help. The real problem with the bacterium is it releases a toxin, and the toxin is incredibly powerful, incredibly virulent. But if you have a tetanus shot, you teach your immune system what that toxin looks like, and your immune system eliminates it. So the immune system also looks for toxins and deals with them. And the last thing, which many of you will have had experience of, is that the immune system sees certain substances as being dangerous when they are not dangerous and reacts to them and causes what we perceive as an allergy. So that the immune system also sees allergens, things which will cause an allergic reaction. This is kind of an aberration of the immune system, which we'll talk about very briefly later on. Just let me do one thing. Okay. So remember those four major things that the immune system can recognize, but realize that pathogens and malignant cells are the really important major things that the immune system will respond to the whole time. When you acquire the ability to resist infection, repeated infection, for example, that we refer to as immunity. This is a word which is on everybody's minds, of course, at the moment, because we're very concerned at the moment about people developing immunity to COVID-19, to this virus which is causing the pandemic at the moment. And that's a good example. Many people who have recovered from COVID-19 have in their circulating in their blood system antibodies to the virus. And because they have antibodies, we regard them, now that they finished their infection, the infection is actually finished, they have circulating, and we regard them as being immune. If they are re-exposed to COVID-19 while they do have a healthy antibody response, they probably won't get it. The immune system has learned what COVID-19 looks like in those people and provides protection against reinfection. For how long, we don't know. In some cases, in some diseases, for instance, like chickenpox, measles, something like that, one exposure, either through illness or through a vaccination early in life, will give you lifelong protection. Your immune system remembers for the rest of your life, and you are said to be immune to those diseases. Now, that is a very, very, very variable response, and the response depends upon genetics. It depends upon your genetic makeup as to exactly how you respond, your immune response responds to a particular pathogen or whatever. The immune response is very, very complex, very complex. We're only going to discuss it in the broadest possible detail. But obviously, at the moment, we are very, very concerned with, as rapidly as possible, developing widespread immunity to COVID-19. And our best way of doing that is by vaccination. Vaccination develops immunity by teaching your immune system how to respond if it actually sees a particular pathogen. So let me explain to you first, though, that there are two major arms to the immune system. And the first arm is we refer to as innate immunity. It's an immune response. It's not a response so much as a set of things that your body has or can do that you are born with, but they always basically the same response. They simply don't change it. The innate immune system has no way of, for instance, of developing memory. So that's the innate immune system. The other arm is called the adaptive immune system. And the adaptive immune system is the system, for example, one of the things it does is produce antibody. And the adaptive immune system is actually able to learn. It is able to change in response to different pathogens, for example. It will produce a different response, but it will remember what it did. That's why we call it adaptive. In the innate system is non-specific in that it, for example, in the innate system, it simply sees bacteria and it has one response to bacteria. It has one single response, no matter what the bacterium is. It has one kind of response for bacteria, another kind of response to fungi, perhaps, this sort of thing. Whereas in the adaptive immune system, it can tell the difference between different strains of virus, for example, and have completely different reactions to the different strains of virus. Part of the innate system is that there's what we refer to it as non-specific, the non-specific immune defenses. And it may sound strange to say that it's part of the immune system, but it is protecting us from pathogens, for example. And it's really simple. When we talk about it, it sounds like common sense. It's like the body has a common sense approach to dealing with the possibility that it could become infected with pathogens. And so, for example, many immunologists will tell you that the most important immune organ is in fact the skin. And it's for this reason. The skin covers our whole body. It protects all of the inner organs. And it is structured to resist colonization by pathogens like bacteria and fungi and those sorts of things. The first way is that the skin has a very rich bacterial and flora. We are covered with bacteria which actually crowd out, for example, pathogens. So they do various other things as well to stop pathogens from getting it. The second part of this non-specific defense system is for our internal organs. The skin protects the outside. On the internal organs, we are protected by the mucous membranes. Now just think about the functioning, for example, of the mucous membranes of the respiratory tract. We talked about this right at the beginning of this class. And I described to you how in the respiratory tract is lined with mucous membrane. And that mucous membrane has ciliated cells which continually conduct mucus up towards the top of the throat. And when they do, they carry with them in the mucus any bacteria, particles, whatever has been trapped in the mucus. So the mucous membranes are another arm of this non-specific defense. The third thing is the nature of our stomach. The stomach actually is a very, very protective organ because it is highly acid. It has a very, very low pH. It has abundant hydrochloric acid in it. And that creates such a harsh environment that a lot of the bacteria which we swallow, which might include pathogens, they are killed in the stomach before they can pass into the gut. And the fourth really important non-specific immune defense is one we've talked about before, and this is inflammation. But I'll discuss it in more detail in a minute. Okay, so let's have a look first at the skin. This is an electron micrograph, a scanning electron micrograph of a piece of skin. Just look at it. Everything that you're seeing here is bacterial, virtually everything. The bacterial rods, these are bacterial cocci, just covering the skin in a carpet. That is the normal. Unfortunately, in modern times, we scrub a lot of this off every day in the shower. We pour soap all over it and scrub it off, which might not be a good idea because this has a very important function. First of all, skin, for your skin, the sweat contains antibacterial compounds. The normal flora are adapted to that. They're unaffected by the sweat. But pathogens, newcomers, in other words, can be killed off by antibacterial compounds and in the sweat. In addition, the salt in sweat creates a harsh environment for bacteria. The normal flora are adapted to it. These do something else. They also crowd out pathogens. So there's no room for pathogens to grow. They also produce their own antibiotics. This may sound strange, but just realize when you look at this, how bacteria are competing with one another for nutrients and everything else. Many bacteria produce compounds which limit the growth of other bacteria around them, antibiotics. So that they have an advantage. So they have a competitive advantage. And one of the things they do is they limit the growth of pathogens on the surface of the skin. The last thing is we look at the structure of skin. To go back to where we discussed skin, and you'll remember, we said skin cells grow very rapidly and they march up like a conveyor belt from where they're generated to the surface. And when they get close to the surface, the skin cells actually die. They become toughened and flattened and they stick together. But the very surface ones actually flake off. We continually produce skin flakes. That is perfectly normal. And when a skin flake breaks off, it takes with it a great patch of bacteria. So it is a way of actually limiting this population, but also of getting rid of potential pathogens which have settled. Now, this is not a perfect system. And there are certain things which have adapted to get around all of these protective mechanisms. And one group that are quite good at it are the fungi. And there are a number of fungi which, for instance, cause things like athlete's foot, that sort of thing, which have strategies for infecting skin. But by and large, we are very, very well protected from pathogens by our skin because of these mechanisms. So let's have a look at the mucous membranes, our next passive kind of immune system. And first of all, remember that it's the responsibility of the mucous membranes. They're called that because they produce mucus. You see these big cells here, here, in this diagram here. These are called goblet cells, and they produce mucus. They produce mucus which forms a sheet of mucus over the mucous membranes. These cells here, you can see, are ciliated. These are all these fine hairs are cilia, and these beat in a coordinated fashion that they keep this sheet of mucus moving, and it moves from low down in your respiratory tract. It moves up to the back of your throat, where unconsciously you continually swallow that sheet of mucus, and it then goes to the stomach where any bacteria in it are killed. This is called the mucociliary escalator. It's a good description. The mucociliary, muco because it's mucus sheet, ciliary because it's moved by the cilia, and escalator because it moves up from the low down in your respiratory tract to the top. The mucus is not just slime. Mucus has a very particular composition to it, and it traps bacteria that you breathe in. It traps particles, etc. And it is of sufficient viscosity that the cilia can continually beat it in a sheet up to the top of your throat. Mucus also contains various antibacterial compounds, so it actually will kill off bacteria that are in it. The idea is to keep the lower parts of the respiratory tract, the interior of the lungs, to keep them completely sterile, and they are. The very fine parts of the lung, the alveoli, little air sacs where oxygen is exchanged with the blood, those are essentially sterile, and they are kept sterile by this protective mucociliary escalator. Okay, now we did talk about this briefly once before, but I just want to remind you about the inflammatory response. The inflammatory response is a very distinctive response by the cells of the immune system. And it is a response to any breaching of sterile barriers of the body. So, for example, the skin is protecting underlying areas. It's protecting the lower reaches of the skin, the muscles, the organs, everything else that lie underneath. And those all need to be kept sterile. We do not have bacteria circulating in these interior spaces of the body. There is a very, very rapid response to the breaching of those barriers. So, for example, let's just take the example where you spike yourself with a thorn or something like that. The thorn has some bacteria on it, and the thorn also leaves some debris behind. When that happens, you have an injury, and you've potentially introduced bacteria as well. Immediately, there is any tissue damage like that, this group of cells, the mast cells, will respond by releasing histamine. And that is why there is an immediate change in the nature of the tissues. If you spike yourself with a thorn, you'll notice within seconds it begins to redden and it will begin to swell. And that is because of the release of histamine. Histamine changes the nature of the blood vessels. It causes blood vessels here nearby the wound to dilate and causes the walls of the blood vessel to become leaky. They become leaky to two things. The first is they allow a lot of lymph to flow into the area of the wound, and that causes swelling. So we get a reddening, and then we get a swelling, all because of the change in the blood vessels close by. That lymph, by the way, is carrying in all sorts of compounds that I haven't mentioned that lymph contains, which are antibacterial and part of the immune response. So that is largely a response due to the mast cells. All through our body, we have these cells called macrophages. And macrophages will immediately begin to move around and examine. They will pick up any damaged tissues, but they will respond very, very strongly if they find bacteria in the wound. And immediately they find bacteria, they will send messages out to the rest of the immune system, chemical messages, hormone. They're actually immune hormones, which are released, circulate through the body. And what they do is they call in to the area these blood cells here. The PMN stands for polymorphonucleoside. And these are the nucleosides. These are the small cells, small white blood cells, which we regard as being the soldiers of the immune system. They come in and they very rapidly move around the wound. They begin to accumulate quite rapidly. They come in, they can find their way here because they're being summoned by the macrophage. They begin to accumulate them, move around, they, as quickly as possible, eat up everything that they can. They'll eat up bacteria, damaged tissue, all of this sort of thing. They don't move away. They accumulate there, and they can actually accumulate as they die to form pus. And this is the classic inflammatory response of the immune. Very, very good response. Usually it's enough. Usually it will take care of any situation like this, clean it up, sterilize it effectively so that the healing process can begin. If it cannot cope with maybe the bacterium or whatever it is growing too rapidly and it can't cope with it, then we move on to the next arm of the immune system, which will start to take care of it, which we'll discuss in a minute, which is the adaptive. But by and large, this inflammatory response is very, very good, very, very efficient at dealing with these kinds of infectious situations. Okay, so this is just a summary for you. And mast cells release histamine, blood vessels dilate and become porous, serum leaks into the area, causes swelling, but also brings in all sorts of compounds which are antibacterial. Macrophages are busy moving around, doing surveillance. If they find pathogens, especially, they will signal to the immune system that something is going on. And then these little, the polymorphonucleoside, they come in. Their name is, the other name are neutrophils. And the neutrophils migrate in. They attack and eat pathogens. They accumulate as pus. And then once they've dealt with everything, the macrophages actually do all the cleaning up. And the cells of the epithelium, if this is a skin wound, the cells of the epithelium will heal and repair all the damage. So if indeed the bacterial infection starts to get out of hand, and this inflammatory response can't cope with it, or in the case of viral infections and things like that, where actually this inflammatory response does not deal particularly well with a viral infection, then this next branch of the immune system, called the adaptive immune system, is called into play. And the adaptive immune system responds very specifically, very, very specifically to potential pathogens, things like that, even if it's never seen them before. It actually learns how to respond to a particular pathogen. And it remembers how it did it, so that if it ever sees that pathogen again, it can respond extremely rapidly to its presence. So those are the things, the key things about the adaptive response. It's very, very specific. It doesn't just respond in a generalized way like the inflammatory response. It's responding to a particular element. And that particular element that it responds to, we refer to as an antigen. I'll explain a little bit more in a while. Even if it's not ever seen that antigen before, it learns how to respond to it, how to neutralize that antigen, and it keeps a memory of that response. So it sees that antigen again, it can respond very rapidly to it without it causing any problems. So there are three, we say there's three arms to this adaptive response. The first is the production of antibody. Antibody is a substance which is released into the blood circulatory system to percolate along with the serum, along with the lymph, all through our body. And the antibody will bind to antigen. So we'll talk about its function in a second. So the antibody response is one thing. The next response is almost as important, and that is there is a group of cells in the adaptive system which are able to go to cells which have been infected, especially with virus, for example. If you have a viral infection, the virus has to enter cells in order to reproduce. And our adaptive immune response can recognize cells which are infected with virus, and it will they will actually kill those cells. This is the cell killing response. This is cytotoxic, means toxic to cells. This is a cytotoxic response. It kills cells which are infected. The third really important arm of the adaptive response is this. It's the formation of memory. All of this here, the antibody response, the cell killing responses, takes time. It takes usually 10 days to 2 weeks to produce a full-blown adaptive response. That's quite a long time. But if ever you see that pathogen again, you'll do it within hours. You'll get the same response within hours. In fact, if you are immune to something, you very seldom even know that you've been exposed again. Your immune response is so rapid that it knocks the pathogen out without you even realizing that anything is going on. So the first thing to talk about is this. It's the nature of antibody. Antibody is a protein. There are thousands of, we can produce thousands upon thousands of different antibodies in a lifetime, 10,000, whatever. And antibody is a protein. It is very specific to a particular substance, to one particular substance, which we call the antigen. And antibody to an antigen seldom reacts to any other antigen at all. So it's highly specific. It's a disease-fighting protein. And what it does is it interferes with the ability of pathogens to cause infection. Antibody can do this in various ways. The first is a simple one to imagine. The antibody acts as a glue. Many of these pathogens, for instance, viruses, are extremely small. They're very difficult for things like macrophages, for example, to see because they are so small. But antibody can stick to these viruses, and it can cause different viral particles to stick together, and it can start to form large clumps. Those viruses can't now infect cells. That's the first thing. The second thing is it's very easy for things like the macrophages and another group of cells called the dendritic cells to actually see them and be able to eat them. To eat that clump is much easier than trying to eat a single virus. Just antibody just sticking to something like a virus or sticking all over a bacterium can inactivate it and stop it from being able to cause infection. And there's a third thing that antibody can do. It actually interacts with some other proteins in the serum to actually burst bacterial cells. It actually ends up boring a hole through the wall of bacteria and causing them to burst. So antibody has many different kinds of functions, but it's all the antibody is produced by one group of cells in the immune system, which we'll talk about in a while. So here is just an illustration for you. Anything, a virus, a bacterium, anything like that, a pathogen like this, may have on its outside, especially on its outside, because that's what the immune system sees. It may have many, many, many elements, particularly proteins, which the immune system can react to. All of these are antigens. Okay, so you can picture that on the surface of a pathogen, there will be many antigens, many possible antigens, which the immune system can respond to. This here is antibody. This is actually simple diagram, but it actually is pretty much what it looks like. It's a Y-shaped, big, huge Y-shaped molecule like this. And this is the business end here. This end here responds very, very, very specifically to a particular antigen. It will only react to this antigen. It won't react to this one because it's a different antigen. Okay. Your body, when it sees this pathogen, will learn to produce antibody, and it will probably produce antibody to several of the antigens that it sees on the outside. Each of those antigens unique, each of those antibodies unique to the particular antigen that it's reacting to. So just for your interest, and to finish off for today, here is the COVID-19 virus. This proper name is SARS-CoV-2. So severe acute respiratory syndrome, coronavirus 2. That's what it stands for, SARS-CoV-2. Here it is here. This is the viral particle, very, 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 very small, way below our ability to see with a light microscope. We'd have to visualize it with an electron microscope. You can see it has an envelope around it here. And then inside here, this is its genetic material. It's actually RNA. It's a coil of RNA. But this is what our immune system sees. It sees the outside, and it will react most strongly to these outside. This is the envelope here is very like plasma membrane. But embedded in it are all of these proteins, which are viral proteins. They've been created as part of the viral reproductive process. These are called the spike proteins here. Glycoprotein, by the way, glycoprotein is a protein that has some sugars on it. So this is, that's the glycoprotein there. There are other proteins. Here's another one called the M protein here. And then there is another one here called the E protein. These are all potentially targets of the immune response. But we are particularly interested in this one here, which is the spike protein, the spike glycoprotein. And this is the one most vaccine efforts are currently being directed at. So you may have heard of the Pfizer vaccine. The Pfizer vaccine is a very clever vaccine because what it does is the vaccine teaches our body to actually make this protein. It gets the cells of our body to make this protein in a soluble form, which then circulates in our blood, and our immune system produces antibodies against it. And those antibodies hopefully protect us if ever we're exposed to the virus itself. So that's the way the Pfizer vaccine currently works. There are other vaccines which are actually injecting these spike proteins directly and keep trying to get an immune response to produce antibody to the spike proteins themselves. Okay, in addition, just remember what I told you right at the beginning here, that there is this response as well. There is a cell killing response. And what the vaccine should do is also hopefully teach that arm, the cell killing arm, how to recognize cells that are infected with COVID and kill them so that the COVID stops reproducing in our body. And at the moment, the signs are good. The Pfizer vaccine, they say, gives extremely good protection against the virus. Now we just got to go through a period of months when they are doing the safety trials, because you want to make sure that any vaccine is actually safe. It doesn't cause side effects, which could be dangerous. Okay, so we'll stop there for today, and then I'll see you again on Wednesday.